Awesome. Well, I'm so glad that we could all get together today during lunch. Please enjoy snacks. There's fresh coffee that was made. I worked with a lot of you in different capacities, but I also work externally. I've been working on the UNICEF Peacebuilding Education and Advocacy Program since January. So really externally facing, and part of the mandate with that, with our partnership with them, was, we talk a lot about sharing lessons learned and collaborating, coordinating, and publicly kind of sharing what we do, but we don't often do it. At Search, I think we do it a little bit more than some other organizations sometimes, but especially to get a chance to really look at the education space and how it's integrating with peace building and with conflict work was a unique opportunity to kind of look outside of our own scope, really dig down into UNICEF programs, Save the Children, World Vision, and other actors in this space that we don't always collaborate with, and kind of pull together a practical guide to be used in the field. And so out of this collaboration came the Emerging Practices Guide. It's quite a long title, quite a mouthful, but it's really focused on design, monitoring, and evaluation, the whole cycle of support to a program, and making sure that we know what we're doing in this new space. So education for peace building is cross-sectoral. It's not taking peace building as kind of an indirect or secondary outcome. It means peace building is upfront with and equal with education outcomes in the programming. And vice versa, people coming to it from an education perspective, or us coming to it from a peace building perspective, really making sure that education is one of the main driving factors of the peace building program that we're doing when we're doing this cross-sectoral work. And because it's new, the theories of change are unvalidated, the type of work that we're doing is innovative, is a little bit new, or really, taking what we have been doing in some small ways across our different countries, and building on it, really making it a strong cross-sectoral type of programming. So today, I want to go over a brief overview of the guide, kind of where it came from, then a process of how the guide was developed. It was certainly not me sitting behind a computer the entire time. There were a lot of interviews, a lot of key informant interviews, and working and vetting it through different stakeholders in the field. Then there's 4 chapters in the guide. It's 60 pages total, meant to be kind of flexible. Again, throw in your bag to, go out to do some field work and have as a quick reference, and briefly go over those, talking about what are the key considerations for these different parts of the project cycle, and also what are some tools that are highlighted in the guide that are useful for both design, monitoring, and evaluation, and finally ending up with some questions and answers. Some of this, obviously, it's a guide on design, monitoring, and evaluation, is a little bit M&E heavy and focused. So if you have questions or clarification, just give me a shout out. I can pause and explain something a little bit better. But hopefully this will really talk on the education for peace building space and how we've been sharing and talking about this when we go to places like the USAID Education Summit, when we were at the AEA last week, when we presented at the INEE, the Interagency Network on Education Emergencies, at the end of October, and how we've kind of been interacting as Search with these different actors in the education space. So the goal of the guide is, as I mentioned earlier, to contribute to the learning and growth of education for peacebuilding programming through documentation of emerging M&E practices. Originally, we often talk about best practices, and that was certainly part of the conversation in the beginning of the development of this guide, but they're not fully vetted. Every education actor in the education space has not tried these tools, has not, it hasn't been in every country where the education work has been done. So we wanted to highlight some tools that had been preliminarily vetted, but there's still a long way to go, from when we start to see tools that work very well and can be utilized, and actual best practices with a lot of research behind it. And there are a few questions that kind of led the discussion of the guide and what you'll find inside the guide, mainly focusing on what are the considerations that are particular and specific for this space for education for peace building. And how are those even more unique because of the complex conflict environment in which these programs are typically implemented. And then finally, what are relevant tools? Again, I hope you see it when you read through the guide. I hope you hear it throughout the presentation. Practicality was the main goal for this. So the process of developing the guide, first we went through an extensive document review, an annotated bibliography that was approved by UNICEF and reviewed by a few different consultants that we had working on this to make sure there was an equal balance in representation between both peacebuilding, education, and general M&E sector. There was input from the UNICEF Peacebuilding Education and Advocacy Headquarters team, the program management team there, which is composed of 5 different people. The Peacebuilding Support Office, the Peacebuilding Fund at UNICEF, the Gender Sensitivity Specialist, the head of Gender Sensitivity at UNICEF, the Humanitarian and Transition Office, 4 regional offices and country office staff, both the country leaders and the M&E officers in 14 different countries through 2 rounds. So a lot of UNICEF feedback went into this. There was also guidance by 2 consultants, and they may be a little bit less familiar in the peacebuilding space, but these really have been the leaders in education and emergencies, education and conflict for a really long time. Christopher Talbot is one of the founding members of the Interagency Network on Education and Emergencies, and Cynthia Coons has been she's everywhere. Every organization that does education and emergencies, her name will crop up. She really helps support the back end and how we do programming and making sure that it's vetted in this field. And then finally, there were 3 rounds of external reviews, both intensive, so people reading a draft and going line by line providing feedback, as well as some webinars, which was more people just overarching feedback, what's missing, what would you like to see in there. From the PEIC, from Qatar University, Save the Children, the Education in Crisis and Conflict Network from USAID staff and members, INEE staff and members, Children in Crisis, Search for Common Ground, both field program staff and M&E staff, and many more. So what you're getting is not just from the mind of one person, but is really a collaboration of shared lessons learned in this space. Now into the interesting stuff, the content. So there's a quick, chapter 1 is very quick. It's just key terms and definitions. I won't go through these. We use these key terms and definitions often in our work on a regular basis. But because this is meant for multiple agencies, we don't always mean the same thing when we use these terms. And so kind of putting out working definitions for this guide in particular, and what we meant when we were talking about quality education or conflict-sensitive education was really important. So that kind of gives you some background and language that has been used around those terms. Again, it's been vetted by a lot of people, so while not every definition is the Bible for how we talk about education for peacebuilding, it's a pretty good source as far as language if you're looking to do proposals or looking to work in this space as far as what the community accepts. Chapter 2, designing and planning. So what are the key considerations for design when you're doing education for peacebuilding programming? So the first is inclusivity and conflict sensitivity of participation between the 2 sectors. And this means that yes, education specialists and peacebuilding specialists have to be at the same table. Now this looks many different ways and works along the spectrum of participation. This may mean that your stakeholders on the ground, your beneficiaries, your local partners are involved step by step in the design, and that they represent education if you're coming from the peacebuilding sector. Or you could have education and peacebuilding specialists on both levels of that. but you are merging two fields. This isn't tokenism. We're not trying to just, add a peace education component to a really strong education program or vice versa. And so how do you make sure that the key objectives, the way of thinking about these two different sectors is really combined from the get-go, which has really been shown to be crucial when implementing these types of programs. And part of what this will allow you to do is identify entry points. So you don't have to start from ground zero on this. You don't have to have a clean slate to do education for peace building work. There are oftentimes many very feasible and easily accessible programs that we're already doing where we can interweave some of these components and really flesh out a cross-sectoral program that carries over more benefit. And this has been a really big part of the conversation in the education space about making education for peace building the new standard in education, which can be controversial depending on the audience. But typically the talking points on this and what's important to highlight is that there's an 80-20 rule. So children in school, which is already leaving out a large population, but there's 70 million children in the world out of school, 40 million of which are in conflict-affected environments. 20% of their time is spent in school. That means 80% of their time, they're in different learning environments that usually have a stronger influence on how they grow, what they're exposed to, and how they participate. So education for peace building is about looking at that system, the complexity that's involved in a safe learning environment that goes beyond the classroom. So what does it look like when they go home? What does it look like when they go to the football pitches after school? Are there people there to support, healthy engagement between them, their peers, being able to do this? So one really good example of this was child-to-child clubs in Somalia, which have been implemented in schools, facilitated by the schools through UNICEF for quite a number of years. And the programs were not exactly extracurricular. They were interwoven with the school program and led by teachers. But it was focused on life skills. So then the education for peace building component kind of built into it equal outcomes on teaching peace building, alternative dispute resolution, and also talking about, identified through the conflict analysis, talking about the drivers of the conflict that the children were facing on a daily basis. And this not only led to a healthier school environment where the students were taking over the dispute resolution and lowering the number of disputes that were happening at the school, but also them engaging more in their community. Even in best case scenarios, we were seeing that they were going to interclan conflicts and asking to talk to both sides and bring them together to talk through some of the issues. And there's a case study on that if you want to hear more specifically about how that program worked out. So the second is analyzing the conflict context. For those of you who already work in conflict, hopefully you know how crucial this is to what we do. And it's not just a one-time thing. It certainly needs to be in design, but it needs to be iterative, especially depending on how and assessing how rapidly your context is evolving. And so there are good tools. The tool that we actually highlight in the guide is the conflict scans developed by Search for Common Ground. We've been using them in Burundi, in DRC. It's an excellent, really quick way to get some feedback and practical recommendations based on how the conflict is actually evolving for your program. And finally, on design, it's understanding incremental components of long-term change. Both education and peace building are long-term change programs, right? The outcomes that we're looking for are long-term, but most project cycles are a year, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years if you're super lucky. And so how do we look at the incremental changes that lead to the long-term changes we want to see? And how do we make sure we're measuring those accurately and vetting them, right? What we think may be the incremental changes may not actually be how change happens in that context. And so part of design is breaking it down and making sure that you're involving monitoring and evaluation throughout the entire project to double check on whether or not that's the change you want to look for. I already talked a little bit about the conflict scans. Again, this is one of the highlighted tools within the design portion of the guide. Our example from Burundi, one of the most recent uses of the tool was there were 561 participants. The conflict scan was an updated and shorted survey followed up with some focus groups and interviews that was based off the original conflict analysis. So you're not basing it off of thin air, you do have to have that first starting point. And it took 3 weeks to turn around, which for any of you who do conflict analyses, that's huge. 3 weeks to actually be able to do those surveys, do the interviews, and have some analysis to be able to feed back into your programs. That's feasible as far as, you know, getting quick turnaround and feedback that you can actually practically work on and adapt to. Monitoring changes. So what are the key considerations for monitoring throughout your program? And the design monitoring and evaluation in this field in particular, because it's new and cross-sectoral, bleeds into each other a lot. So we already talked a little bit about, you know, the conflict scans would also be used for monitoring, right? They would happen throughout the life cycle of your project. But it's also important that you're monitoring the context and the program to maintain conflict sensitivity. There's a really great paper out on the 2 phases of education, how education is never neutral. It's either positively influencing the environment or negatively influencing the environment, and has huge systematic impacts on wherever you are, right? Whatever the curriculum is, it has influences from a historical perception of how things have happened. However, educational resources are distributed, whether it be to refugee, out of school populations or to the schools themselves, can carry inequity and discrimination within it. So it's really important throughout the monitoring process that you're looking both at the context, as we've already discussed, but especially at the program and how the program that you're implementing itself is impacting the environment in which you're working, and you're both direct and indirect beneficiaries. Second, be prepared to be wrong. We don't like being wrong in this field. I feel like we're very married some ways to the way we believe change happens. But as I mentioned, and I'll say it again and again, this is new, this is cross-sectoral. We don't have all the answers, right? It hasn't been fully validated. And so we need to keep iterating and keep being prepared to be okay to be wrong, and then adjusting, right? Let's learn from it. Let's compile what we know and have a next iteration that is better, that is trying something that is getting us closer and closer to validated programming and theories of change that we know work. And finally, you have to balance rigor, simplification, and ethics, especially in this space. As education specialists well know, you're working with children and youth, which has each demographic population that you work with has its own quirks, its own considerations. But for children and youth, the tools that you use need to be simplified. The language that you use in these tools needs to be simplified. And how do you do that without losing rigor, without really getting to that validation that you want, and with maintaining ethics, especially in conflict? This is tricky, which is the ethical review that UNICEF recommends that everyone uses. So one of the main parts of it is that you get parental consent whenever you're interviewing children or youth. But in contexts where parents may be one of the problems, or harmful ramifications can come from parents knowing that you're interviewing children, you really have to consider the process that you're going about it and where and when you can collect data, even if it isn't your best case scenario. Always making sure that we're putting do no harm and conflict sensitivity first and foremost when we're looking about how we implement programming and monitoring and evaluation. And so there's more throughout the guide on how to balance those 3, especially talking about mixed methods and how it's not optional when you're doing education for peace building. Again, long-term nuance and behavior change type of outcomes that we're looking for. So the quantitative elements that you would capture is not going to necessarily give you all the information that you need. It's not going to answer that why question. So one of the things that we've been measuring both quantitative and qualitatively in this type of programming as it's emerged is social cohesion, which is a very abstract, large term. But we have broken it down into components and seen success with measuring it this way. The 5 key components that we broke it down into was trust, belonging and inclusion, participation, tolerance, and recognition and legitimacy. And so we involve these both in participatory focus groups, key stakeholder interviews, both semi-structured and structured, as well as knowledge, attitude, and perception surveys. And so there's an example of a full survey in the guide itself and how the questions were worded, but making sure that we're trying to capture some of these aspects of the change we're trying to see, both quantitatively and qualitatively, to help us and inform our programming along the way. And finally, evaluation considerations. So the 3 top considerations for evaluations, both midterm evaluations, also known as formative evaluations, and end-term evaluations, also known as summative evaluations, is that evaluators themselves, or evaluation teams, need to have an understanding of both sectors, both education and peacebuilding. The way we measure change in peacebuilding is different from the way change is measured in education and vice versa. So you need to make sure that at some point in developing, designing, and implementing your evaluation, that both parties are coming to the table and are providing some insight and guidance. Second, be flexible. For any of you that have worked in conflict, you well know that where you collect data once may no longer be accessible. So how do you make the adaptations that you need and adjustments and still have the comparison points to get really down to the meat of how change has happened and what impacts have occurred during your program. And the guide talks a lot about how to prepare for different logistical challenges like that, and what are some possible alternatives to that. Some of it is using a midterm as a baseline if you need to kind of push the scope further and still have a comparison point. And there are a lot of other practical tips in the guide on that as well. And the last is, as I mentioned before, be conflict sensitive. How you ask questions, which questions you ask, who you're talking to when, who you have talked to who. In some contexts, it doesn't matter if your interviewer is male or female. In some, it very much does. In some contexts, it doesn't matter the age. In others, it does. The public or private space in which you talk to a group or have a private interview or a one-on-one interview really does make an influence. And these are things that kind of can get thrown to the wayside in logistics. And so how do we make sure in every single part of what we do that we're being conflict sensitive and putting the beneficiaries first? And these are, I don't think we have a lot of evaluators in the room, so I will avoid going in depth here, but kind of highlighting 4 evaluation approaches that are highlighted in the guide and some reasoning as to why they're a better fit than some other evaluation approaches for this particular sector at this particular time. So there's more information on that, on how to be right-sized, relevant, respectful, and rigorous all at the same time, as well as 1 or 2 evaluation approaches that are not a very good fit, and why, and how to adjust them if you need to use that, depending on donor requirements, or if you have a preference. And so how do we get from emerging to best practice, and where is the field now? So the humanitarian sector and the development sector have rubbed against each other from time to time in the past, but there's a real momentum towards bringing these 2 sectors, including peacebuilding, closer together. This has been highlighted through the SDGs, both incorporating a quality education, number 4, quality education development goal that includes a focus on conflict, as well as goal 16, which is on peace and justice. So both of them being together, both of them talking, especially the quality education one talking about conflict, is a really big win for cross-sectoral work. and having objectives that are not just token. Along with this, GPE has increased their support. There's $40 billion available over the global, the Global Protection in Education Network. They fund a lot of curriculum, like conflict-sensitive curriculum development. They work very closely with UNICEF. They announced a $40 billion fund for this education, with a special emphasis on education in crisis, conflict, and protracted conflict, which is like a first-time thing. It's a big highlight for working in this cross-sectoral space. ECHO's doubled their funding. USAID just redid their 3 strategic goals with a bigger emphasis on not just access to education in conflict, crisis, and protracted crisis, which was their goal 3 for the past 3 years, but really expanding access and what does access mean and how is that done conflict sensitively, which is huge. Like, these are huge organizations in the space of education that are reorienting themselves to work in this cross-sectoral space and pay more attention to how we do things in conflict, and that's really important. On the peacebuilding side of things, there were 3 key peacebuilding reviews that highlighted the role of social services and integrating peacebuilding into social services, and social services having more coordination between them and peacebuilding efforts. And the upcoming World Humanitarian Summit will focus, some of the key focuses are on reducing vulnerability and serving the needs of people in conflict. So there is, if you haven't felt it, if you haven't seen it, there is momentum in this space. There is change happening, and it's a really great time for people looking to kind of merge or work cross-sectorally to kind of have a voice and be part of the new types of programming that's happening. So that's it for today. I'd like to open up for questions, technical, non-technical, whatever you got, throw it at me.
So, hi, Julia, person with Jesuit Refugee Service. So how are you hoping that the guide will be disseminated and utilized? I know that's sort of a challenge sometimes. Like, you put so much work into it, it's fantastic information, but just implementation of it and acceptance of it, you know, across the sector.
Yeah, so our dissemination strategy so far is both virtual and in person. So we presented on it last week at the American Evaluation Association conference, so kind of hitting the M&E crowd, and had quite a big turnout and a lot of interest in it. We have physical copies. UNICEF is getting 100 of them that will go to all of their country offices and be kind of in all of those different offices I talked about earlier, which is a big win as far as usability within that kind of multilateral space. We have a webinar tomorrow morning through DME for Peace that's hoping to kind of hit more of the international crowd and make sure that like practitioners can join in the conversation that's happening. We have a co-sponsored event in Boston to talk to the academic crowd that EDC is hosting December 21st. And reaching out to everyone who helped on this. There's a lot of Jim Rogan from ECCN, Pete Sims from Children in Crisis, a lot of people who want to disseminate it within their own organizations. So there is momentum, but if you have more ways that you want it to be shared and share out, I would love to hear ideas on how to get it into more people's hands.
I know I've shared it with our practitioners, so so that's the first step. Thanks.
Wonderful. I'll let you share first.
Yeah, I was just third time I see this presentation. It's still my favorite. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more on some of the. I realize that this is looking back on a limited amount of programming and actual projects, but some of the actual kind of practicalities of like this is what it looked like. This is how we learned what we learned, because I know that there was a lot of work that came from the PBA over the past 4 years on this. So just maybe you mentioned the Somalia example, I believe. Sitting into that, or maybe the Cote d'Ivoire.
Yeah. So Cote d'Ivoire, also one of our Search for Common Ground programs, is highlighted in there. We worked with Insight Share and UNICEF on that program. It's peace clubs. A little bit similar to the child-to-child club model, but more focused directly on conflict resolution and engaging with youth. And the interesting thing about that model is it actually reaches outside the school environment. So not just as an outcome, expecting it to bleed into the community, the efforts and the impacts, but actually they realized that some of the youth who had been former soldiers were engaging and influencing clubs and gangs within the school environment. And so they readapted their model to reach out to those youth and engage them in the peace clubs, which were internal to the schools. And in quite a few cases, there are some really great videos by Insight Share using the most significant change method that are talked about in the guide that really highlight how the outside influencers to the school sometimes became the best leaders and change makers for the school environment, and really were able to take that leadership role for peace building. And one of the stories that's shared is a former soldier was in gangs before he was involved in the conflict, started another gang once he got out of the conflict, and his girlfriend actually brought him into the peace club environment. And he became he became president of the club, a spokesperson for the club, and now he's made a commitment to go back to every community where he had been while he was a soldier and preach peace and share with them about how peace can create a better future for Cote d'Ivoire and for their community, and talk about resolution. And so really seeing that, we are addressing and talking about the individual level, but how do we go beyond that? How do we really make systematic community level changes? Another example is in South Sudan. They actually incorporated a livelihoods mechanism into their educational peacebuilding programming. Talk about cross-sectoral. And it was widely successful because a lot of times when you're dealing with an older age range of youth, they need those technical skills, right? They may not have gone to school. They certainly don't feel like they have the time to go to school now. And you're also dealing with migrant populations. And so what do you offer them to get them to be part of programming that you see as valuable, that you see as value add? And one of the requests was around livestock livelihoods. And so they provided a program for them on a match of kind of an incentivized, come be part of the programming. We'll teach you some new livestock skills, also provide you with livestock. And that's a really interesting example in a rapidly evolving context. So there are, this is kind of technical. It touches on, the behind the scenes work that really drives down into how do we make sure we're doing what we want to do and we're doing it well. But it's affecting real change. And I think that's important to remember that, we are seeing these bright spots and these highlights. And I think there's 19 or 20 practical examples, stories like this throughout the guide of how different programs and organizations actually carried this out in the field.
I think it's really interesting, and when I was in graduate school, I was taking peace building types of course a lot, but I was also taking education skills class, and when I was looking at dialogue and those trainings, and when I was in peace building program, I was more like a soft liar guy. Some people thought. When I was in that education class, some people thought I was like a more like intense guy. That was like interesting to atmosphere. It's like some sort of culture shock.
Mm-hmm.
But I suppose like when you were working on this, it's like you were crossing those two different cultures and atmosphere to feel. Like, have you had those interesting culture shock or something?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Again, I think that the 2 points that I mentioned about like having both education and peacebuilding specialists at the table, this is why. is because the culture in these two sectors is worlds apart. And the language, that's why we provided working definitions in the first chapter instead of an annex, because the way we talk about things and the way we use similar development rhetoric is different, right? How we would define quality education may not meet the rigorous criteria that is seen by education specialists and has been vetted. There's a reason why they have, a very long definition and kind of a rubric for what is quality education. And I think if you can get past that initial culture shock, it's beneficial. I think there's a natural inclination for educationalists and peacebuilding specialists to work together. It's just getting through that initial push of the silos, which is, it's not just education and peacebuilding, right? It's any sector. It's WASH, it's healthcare, it's, livelihoods and, economic ventures. And how do you break the silos that have so strategically been built, through competition, through the different, the Millennium Development Goals and how, we kind of operate in the development sphere. And so, yeah, if you are in that space where you're acting with cross-sectoral actors, I encourage you and continue to just continue and really keep having those conversations and keep trying to find the commonalities, or as we would say, the common ground. It's there, I promise.
Have these kinds of programs been implemented with schools that are already established as partners to the programs, or has there been like some examples of places where it has been established simultaneously while establishing a school?
Yeah, so the types of programs that, not just UNICEF programs, but other ones that I, pulled from and talked to, both worked in the out of school space. So working with non-traditional, non-formal types of education work, as well as with already established networks of schools. The Somalia one is an example of that. The connections were already made with the school. They were implementing kind of a revisal of something that had already been there. With these particular programs, there has been less implementation with like physical infrastructure development. But that actually was a big part of the conversation at the Interagency Network on Education Emergencies in October, as well as part of a few of the conversations at the USAID Education Summit on, when you do infrastructure building, and there's been some really great success with recent crises on this and how to do it rapidly. There was a really great example from Nepal on how this was done around the earthquake. How do you get that short-term thinking of we need a safe physical space to the medium and long term? And that's part of kind of that spectrum. It's closing that spectrum. There's still certainly very strong humanitarian actors and development actors, but there is a desire to, when you look at refugees now, the average years that they spend abroad is 20. That's not an emergency. That's a long-term structural problem that needs long-term focus, right? And yes, we still need short-term to people who can kind of swoop in and really get the work, motivated and started. But how do we bridge those gaps that often happen between the short and the long-term thinking and efforts? So I don't have the answer today. May not have the answer for quite some time, but those conversations are happening, and I can connect you with people who are working in that space if you'd like.
Yeah, because also I think that it's interesting to see the whole refugee situation too. And the fact that education in the countries that they're being hosted in are really limited. And so there are some examples like in Lebanon where they've created schools. And the schools have found, like if you do an assessment of the schools, you find that they become the center for anything that has to do with dealing with trauma, dealing with family issues. So they become like more of just the school and the educators, but also the guidance counselors, and even provide some sort of like structure. So I find it really necessary for this type of programming, which is why I was kind of wondering if there was any examples where it has been established in refugee.
There's a really big push. The problem is that anytime we come up with a phrase or a type of programming, it gets pushed into a different corner or sector, right? So social emotional learning really captures everything that you just said and is a concurrent push that UNICEF is really working on in this space as well. There is a lot of overlap with the Education for Peacebuilding push, but they're still trying to sell everyone on social emotional learning, which means like there's certainly value, but not everyone is ready to, you know, provide or has the capacity to provide the psychosocial support that's necessary in these types of environments. And so how do you make sure that both types of work that are equal important kind of get spotlight so that you can then bring them back together? So there is crossover. We've done actually, Search for Common Ground has done quite a few case studies on the different PBA programs, as well as other actors have, the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative, as well as multiple universities who have been working on this project, University of Amsterdam, University of Geneva, and a few others. And those talk about these different types of crossover. So there is one on social emotional learning within the Education for Peacebuilding space. Those are owned by UNICEF, so they get released on a different schedule than some of the other deliverables, but they should all be available by June 2016. So, and we'll post them on DM&E for Peace on the education community of practice. So look out for those, they will be coming.
I was going to ask, what about appropriation by the ministries of education, and how do you integrate this into like the proper school system, and in a more sustainable way? Yeah.
So a big part. Well, first of all, it takes a lot of time, a lot of buy-in, and a lot of time. And the entry point in some of the countries was the conflict analysis. It wasn't always called that. It was called social cohesion report in Pakistan due to political sensitivity around peace building, by many different names, but really bringing that as a value add, saying we've identified some areas where we can help support, strengthen your educational programming on all different, at a systematic level, and getting them to accept that at the crucial moment when they read you their education sector plans has really been key. It was ongoing work in Burundi. It's been stalled a bit, but getting them to rethink and develop conflict sensitivity and peace building aims into the larger education sector plans is a really big win. Also providing them with different types of education from hard to access populations. So on page 46 and 47, maybe. There are two examples around U-Report and EduTrack systems, and both of those are larger systems-based, tech-based M&E reporting systems that we actually provided to the ministries of education. And this was, again, it's like, how do you integrate yourself to have a voice at the seat at the table? And this, especially the EduTrack system, it wasn't just in Education for Peacebuilding Programming. It's been done in Chile and a few different other countries with relatively really strong success as far as providing them with insight, direct insight from their constituents, from the population, from hard to reach areas on how they viewed the education system and what changes they wanted to see. And then if you've convinced them to give you a seat at the table, we've also been able to serve as kind of interpreter for that. Like, not that you just get all this information, but providing that analytical lens for application strategically to do this type of programming and help build a stronger, more long-lasting education system.
To follow up on that example, what were the ethical concerns there about it? Because what you're just describing of, we're going to give you this data and hopefully you'll let us analyze it and translate it for you. But you are also opening up data to governments in conflict zones. So what were the ethical implications or safeguards there?
Yeah, so there are a bunch. And I mean, there are always ethical concerns, especially when you're doing SMS feedback and open data sourcing, which this was not. This was a very strategic, limited data sourcing to the Ministry of Education. We were very upfront. The EduTrack system is very upfront with participants on where the information is going. This is going to your government to help support the way you get education. So it wasn't like we were doing a programmatic survey and then like saddling that to the Ministry of Education. It's like a feedback mechanism specifically for, they know it's going to the government. As far as analysis goes and use, the questions are very carefully picked, no matter what system, context-based, no matter what system you're using, as far as ones that can be ill-interpreted, like are especially sensitive to being ill-interpreted. Part of it is getting them to accept large amounts of data and extra information into their system is in itself a stepping stone. And then you kind of fight for being able to provide additional analysis and recommendations, which oftentimes they're more open to because it's practical, right? Like, what are they going to do with amounts of data besides say that they've ticked a box and that they are being more participatory? And so that was less of a problem once we got the system integrated, which already is complex. And there's more on Learning for Peace, that website, as well as if you just Google EduTrack systems, there are a bunch of other case studies and how it was implemented and kind of stories from different countries.
So kind of on a brass tacks kind of thing, how long did that review process take you for all those organizations?
Long time.
Yeah.
So like I said, I started in January, kind of right out of the gate we finalized a TOR for the guide, being very specific on audience, that this was for practitioners. There's so many different audiences you could have written this to. You could have written it to policymakers. You could have written it solely to multilaterals. But that practicality point. And then the interviews took until April. The writing started in April, and then the heavy hitting reviews happened over the summer with webinars, some more generalized feedback when we had a version 3 in August, and then final reviews in September, and design and publication in October. I don't know if that's helpful. The longest part is when you get so one of the review committees where people were doing it line by line. This was, Ash Hartwell, Jim Rogan, people whose opinion we need on work like this. That takes the longest just because, even if you give 2 weeks solid deadline, going through the line by line comments, that if you're going to do an endeavor like this, that takes the most time, and making sure they're coordinated and what needs to be included and what doesn't. We wanted to keep, the original goal was 35 to 40 pages. We missed that by a solid margin. It's 60 pages now. But what is necessary for an emerging practice guide? This isn't the Bible on how to do this, so. 3 minutes, anyone else? Any last begging questions?
What do you, oh, sorry, go ahead, sorry.
A quick one is how are we going to make sure that we use it, especially at cert for grant? So have to make sure we include this in our evaluation of current and future Peacebuilding programming, and we just don't. Education is building for. We just don't go, as usual. How do we really incorporate this into our everyday work?
Yeah. So on 2 fronts, the What Works last month was on Education for Peacebuilding, and we talked about this guide coming out. I've already had some requests from field office staff to mail it to them, which we will be doing on request just because there's not endless, limitless copies. But there's a digital version that's very easy to download that's housed on DMD for Peace. The ILT team is working on making sure, the regional specialists and that we're prepared to answer these questions and kind of provide that guidance, especially in proposals. I've been working with Casey and some of the different offices on language around this and how we talk about this, how we represent this. And part of it is just that continued conversations, I think. Making sure it's not this one burst. I mean, that's all we're going to talk about dissemination, right? You have like one really strong month of like talking about it and everyone hears about it, and then, you know, it just kind of filters to the end, and finding ways to make sure that we're bringing this renewed to the conversation, especially because there are plans to kind of follow up, not within a short time frame, but, you know, the next 3 years to come up with like a revised, edited version with new things, because, or things that have been tested more or have, you know, come to the fore. But if you have other ideas.
Yeah, I was just wondering if it also means that as search we're gonna, you know, try to invest a little bit more in the space, or peace building education, or if it's just mostly like we did that for the field in general.
No, we're making moves.
Thank you.
Mike, did you have a?
I was just going to ask you if you planned anything for the World Humanitarian Summit on this.
We haven't. So I've been talking with IME because they're going to have a big presence there, but we haven't planned anything in particular. But I'm happy to if you see a space. Well, I guess that's it. I will wrap up. Thank you guys so much for coming. If you have any other questions, let me know. Make sure everyone takes a copy. Those are for you guys. More if you want to bring more to your office. Yeah, and have a great Wednesday.